On a cold night in early February 1968, in the small town of Orangeburg, South Carolina, a group of young students gathered on the campus of South Carolina State College. They were not armed, they were not violent, and they were not looking for trouble. What they wanted was simple: the chance to be treated with dignity and fairness in their own community. These students represented a generation that refused to remain silent in the face of inequality. They stood together, holding on to hope that their voices could ignite change. But in the span of just a few terrifying seconds, that hope was shattered. Law enforcement opened fire into the crowd of students, and what had begun as a peaceful gathering became a night of fear, pain, and tragedy. By the time the gunfire ended, 3 young men had lost their lives, and 28 others were left wounded. Families were devastated, classmates were traumatized, and a community that had fought for progress was plunged into grief. This was not a distant battlefield. It was not a foreign war zone. It was a college campus in the heart of America. For the students who fell that night, the dream of equality was cut short before it could be fully realized. Yet their story has often been overlooked, buried beneath other events in history. Unlike similar tragedies that would later spark national outrage, this one remained in the shadows, known to only a few outside the town of Orangeburg. The question is, why? Why did such a heartbreaking moment in the struggle for civil rights fade so quickly from the national memory? And what lessons can we take from it today, more than half a century later? The story of that February night is not just about the violence itself, it is about the courage of young people who dared to stand up, the cost of seeking justice, and the way society chooses which stories to remember and which to forget. As we uncover the forgotten cry of the Orangeburg Massacre, we are reminded that history is not only written in the textbooks, it is carried in the lives of people, in the struggles of communities, and in the voices that demand to be heard even decades later. These students may be gone, but their memory remains a powerful symbol of resilience. Their story is not just a moment from the past, it is a lesson for the present and a guide for the future. If you believe stories like this should never be forgotten, then help us share their voices. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications so you won't miss our upcoming explorations into the untold chapters of history. Together, we can shine a light on the past and ensure that these stories are finally given the recognition they deserve. It began with something so ordinary, so everyday, that it might seem almost too small to spark a storm. A simple night out, the idea of young people wanting to enjoy themselves at a local bowling alley. In the winter of 1968, students from South Carolina State College looked toward the all-star bowling lanes in Orangeburg as more than just a place with neon lights and polished lanes. It represented a chance to participate fully in the life of their own town. They weren't asking for anything extravagant. They just wanted to bowl, laugh, and feel like any other young American on a Friday evening. But when they walked up to the glass doors of All-Star, they were met not with a welcome, but with rejection. The owner, standing firm, told them plainly that they could not come inside. It wasn't because the lanes were full, or because the business was closed. It was because of who they were. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 had already outlawed segregation in public places, yet in this small corner of South Carolina, that law was treated as though it didn't exist. The doors of all-star bowling lanes remained firmly closed to anyone with darker skin. For the students, the denial stung, but it was not unfamiliar. They had grown up in a world where signs and rules constantly reminded them of their place in a rigid racial hierarchy. They had seen their parents and grandparents work hard, pay taxes, and contribute to the community, only to be treated as second-class citizens. Yet by 1968, the tide of history was shifting. Young people across America were raising their voices against injustice, inspired by leaders who spoke of nonviolence, dignity, and the unshakable demand for equality. For the students in Orangeburg, that locked bowling alley was more than a door refusing them entry. It was a symbol of every other barrier they had been forced to endure. So they decided they would not simply walk away. Their refusal to accept this denial marked the beginning of something larger. It was an act of defiance not carried out with fists or anger, but with determination and courage. They began to talk among themselves, to organize, to plan. Each conversation carried the weight of generations, and each step they took toward the bowling alley was a statement that they would no longer remain silent in the face of humiliation. When they tried again to enter, they did so not with weapons, but with hope. They stood at the doorway as ordinary young people who simply wanted fairness. Yet the response was swift and harsh. Police were called. Students were arrested. What should have been nothing more than a night of recreation now stood at the edge of something dangerous and unpredictable. Still, the students returned. Larger in number, stronger in spirit, they gathered with signs and chants. Their determination grew, fueled by the knowledge that this wasn't just about a bowling alley. It was about whether the promises of the Civil Rights Act would be honored, whether the sacrifices of activists who had marched and bled for freedom would mean anything in the everyday lives of black citizens in small southern towns. To the authorities, however, this persistence was unsettling. A group of young black students standing together in defiance of segregation represented a challenge to the established order. Tension thickened in the air as police officers positioned themselves around the alley. Helmets, batons, and rifles became the backdrop to what had started as a simple call for fairness. Imagine the scene, students chanting softly, some holding handmade signs, others locking arms, trying to remain calm in the face of intimidation. Across from them, law enforcement stood rigid, eyes watching every movement, fingers tense. The students weren't looking for confrontation. They wanted acknowledgement, dignity, the right to exist in their own community without barriers. Yet their presence alone was treated as a threat. This clash was not about bowling anymore. It was about power, about the very soul of America. On one side, young people who believed that justice was worth standing for, even at personal risk. On the other, a system that had long enforced separation and inequality, now struggling to maintain its grip. The refusal to let them bowl became a spark that illuminated the wider struggle. Over the days that followed, the protests grew. Students met on campus, sharing stories and strengthening their resolve. The more they were denied, the stronger their unity became. They were no longer just fighting for a night of fun at All-Star, they were fighting for the principle that no business, no individual, could place themselves above federal law and human dignity. The simple act of being turned away at a set of glass doors revealed the larger truth: equality was not going to be handed over politely. It had to be demanded. And so, what began as an ordinary night out transformed into a stand against injustice. Those young people in Orangeburg were not only defending their right to bowl, they were stepping into the long river of history, carrying the same determination as those who had marched across bridges, sat at lunch counters, and risked everything for freedom. The locked doors of the All-Star bowling lanes became more than a barrier to recreation. They became a powerful reminder that even the smallest acts of exclusion could ignite a movement when people refused to accept them. That refusal, that insistence on dignity, would soon lead to events far larger and more tragic than anyone could have imagined when the first student stepped up to the door and was told to leave. The early days of February 1968 carried a chill that seemed to hang heavy in the air over Orangeburg. For 3 nights in a row, from the 5th through the 7th, the campus of South Carolina State College became the center of a growing tension. The students had gathered with the same determination that had fueled their earlier protests, their voices rising not in violence, but in songs, chants, and declarations of dignity. They were young, filled with conviction, and unwilling to back down in the face of injustice. But surrounding them, a different energy took shape. Police officers stood in formation, their presence multiplied as the nights went on. The South Carolina National Guard soon joined them, their military gear and heavy vehicles casting shadows across the college grounds. What had begun as a student-led demonstration for fairness now looked, from the outside, like a town bracing for a battle. Imagine the scene: floodlights cutting through the darkness, rows of guardsmen lined up with helmets reflecting the glow, and the low murmur of radios breaking the night's silence. On the other side were the students, many no older than 18 or 19, gathered in clusters across the campus lawn. They carried no weapons, only their voices and the shared belief that change had to come. Some clutched signs, others held hands. A few tried to reassure their classmates, reminding them to stay calm, to keep the peace. But fear has a way of twisting perception. To those who came heavily armed, the students' unity felt like defiance. Every cheer, every chant, every movement across the lawn seemed charged with threat. What the students saw as a call for recognition, many officers interpreted as unrest waiting to explode. On the night of February 7th, as the protest stretched into their third evening, the students gathered around a small fire they had built to keep warm. It was no grand blaze, just flickering flames licking at broken branches, a circle of light against the cold. Some leaned close to it, rubbing their hands, while others joked quietly to ease their nerves. For them, the fire was comfort in the midst of uncertainty, a way to hold on to a sense of normalcy while their campus was surrounded by armed men. But across the line of uniforms, the view was different. To the eyes of those in authority, the flames became something more sinister. They saw not a campfire but a warning, a sign of rebellion, an act meant to provoke. The smoke curling upward seemed to signal unrest, and the student silhouettes dancing in the firelight were misread as threats preparing to strike. It was a tragic misinterpretation, one born of fear, prejudice, and the unwillingness to see these young men and women as what they truly were, students asking to be heard. Instead, the fire became the turning point. Tension that had been simmering for days began to boil over. Commands were shouted. Lines tightened. The atmosphere grew heavier with every passing minute, as if the night itself understood that something irreversible was about to unfold. For the students, the growing wall of officers felt suffocating. They could see rifles in the dim light, hear the clatter of boots on pavement, and feel the weight of eyes locked onto them as though they were enemies rather than neighbors. The fire that had started as warmth now illuminated the divide between them and those who surrounded them. And yet, despite the fear, the students tried to remain calm. Some sang freedom songs to steady their spirits, their voices carrying into the night. Others whispered prayers or reassurances, telling each other that morning would come and the danger would pass. They believed their peaceful stance would protect them, that their innocence would shield them from the worst. But misunderstanding is a powerful force. To the heavily armed men outside the circle of firelight, every movement of the students seemed magnified. The crackle of burning wood sounded like a warning. The laughter of nervous students seemed like mockery. The chants for equality echoed like defiance. And in that distorted lens, a peaceful gathering transformed into what they believed was a threat. Those 3 nights of protest, capped by the glow of a simple bonfire, would soon tip into tragedy. What the students intended as a demonstration of hope was twisted into a justification for force. The fire that had been built for warmth became a symbol of miscommunication, a spark that authorities convinced themselves was the beginning of chaos. As the night of February 7th drew to a close, both sides stood locked in silence, staring at one another across the divide. On one side, youth, determination, and a fragile circle of flames. On the other, fear, suspicion, and weapons primed for use. The smallest misinterpretation now carried the weight of life and death. The following day would reveal just how devastating that misreading could be. The night was dark, but the air was charged with fear and confusion. On the campus of South Carolina State College, students who had gathered in protest were beginning to drift back toward their dormitories. Some walked in small groups, their voices subdued, the tension of the previous days weighing heavily on their shoulders. Others lingered, still talking, still clinging to the hope that their calls for justice might yet be heard. No one imagined how quickly everything was about to unravel. In the distance, a line of officers stood firm, their eyes fixed on the campus lawn. The silence was broken only by the crackle of a nearby fire, the shuffling of boots, and the occasional command whispered from one man to another. The officers had been waiting for hours, their nerves stretched tight, their weapons ready. For the students, their presence felt like a wall, unyielding, immovable, suffocating. And then, in the span of only a few moments, that fragile balance between watchfulness and violence shattered. A sudden burst of sound split the night. It wasn't one shot, or two, it was a barrage. Dozens of rounds were unleashed in a storm of gunfire that tore through the crowd. In less than 15 seconds, the campus lawn was transformed from a place of voices and movement into one of chaos and terror. Students who had been walking calmly now ran desperately for cover. Cries filled the air, mixing with the deafening roar of bullets. Some dove to the ground, others sprinted toward the dormitories, and many simply froze in shock, unable to comprehend what was happening. The officers had unleashed roughly 70 rounds, each one tearing through the night in search of targets that were never truly there. The students were unarmed, caught completely off guard. They had no protection, no defense, no expectation that the protest would end in bloodshed. They were young, hopeful, and full of dreams for the future, and now they were running for their lives. Among the students struck that night were three whose names would become forever tied to the tragedy. Samuel Hammond, just 18 years old, had been a freshman with a passion for sports and a deep love for his family. Henry Smith, only 17, was still a high school student, full of energy and promise, with college on the horizon. And then there was Delano Middleton, also 17, who wasn't even part of the protest. He had simply stopped by the campus after basketball practice, hoping to meet friends before heading home. None of them could have known that the evening would be their last. When the gunfire ceased, silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It was heavier, more suffocating, broken only by the cries of the wounded and the desperate calls for help. Bodies lay scattered on the ground. Students clutched their friends, trying to stop the bleeding with bare hands. Others screamed out names, searching through the darkness for those who had vanished in the chaos. 28 young people were left injured, some gravely, and 3 would never rise again. For those who survived, the moment was etched into their memories forever. The sound of the shots, the smell of smoke, the sight of classmates collapsing, all became part of a story that words could barely capture. Some recalled the overwhelming disbelief: how could it be possible that such violence had erupted against unarmed students on their own campus? Others remembered the faces of Samuel, Henry, and Delano, faces full of youth and potential, now stolen by a burst of gunfire that lasted less than half a minute. What made the tragedy even more unbearable was its senselessness. There had been no attack from the students, no threat that justified such force. They were not charging, they were not armed. They were running, retreating, trying to escape the danger they did not fully understand until it was too late. The storm of bullets did not restore order, it destroyed trust, tore families apart, and left a wound on the community that would never fully heal. In the aftermath, the weight of grief settled heavily over Orangeburg. Families mourned not only the loss of their children but also the loss of innocence, the destruction of hope. Parents buried sons who should have been preparing for college exams, basketball games, and graduation ceremonies. Friends gathered in dormitories and classrooms, speaking in hushed tones, replaying the horror over and over again in their minds. The question on everyone's lips was the same: why? The tragedy of that night was not only in the number of lives taken or injured, but in how quickly it all happened. In less than 15 seconds, 70 rounds had turned a peaceful campus into a battlefield. 15 seconds, that was all it took to end 3 lives, to wound 28 others, and to cast a shadow over an entire community for generations to come. And yet, within the sorrow and devastation, the memory of Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton endured. They became more than names in a report or statistics in a record. They became symbols of a struggle that demanded recognition, justice, and remembrance. Their stories remind us that history is not only shaped by victories and triumphs, but also by tragedies that expose the cost of inequality and the urgency of change. The sound of those shots may have faded into the night, but their echo remains. It lingers in the memory of every survivor, in the hearts of every family, and in the lessons that history continues to teach. For those who were there, 15 seconds felt like an eternity, one that reshaped their lives forever. For us, it stands as a reminder of how quickly injustice can strike, and why the fight for fairness can never be abandoned. In the hours after the shooting ended, when the echoes of gunfire had finally faded into the cold February night, the truth of what had happened still lay scattered across the campus lawn: 3 young lives cut short, dozens more bleeding and broken, and countless others shaken to their core. But even as students rushed to help their friends, even as ambulances carried the wounded away, another story was already taking shape. A story not written by the victims or the witnesses, but by the officials who stepped before cameras and microphones to explain the unexplainable. They painted a picture that bore little resemblance to reality. According to their version, the students had been unruly, aggressive, even dangerous. They claimed that the officers had faced a mob, that they had responded to provocation, that order had been threatened and force had been necessary. To those who had lived through the nightmare, the words felt like a second blow, this time not from bullets, but from lies. The truth was starkly different. The students had not carried weapons. No knives, no guns, no tools of violence were ever recovered from the field where the shots were fired. What the young men and women had brought with them were their voices, their songs, their courage to stand together. Yet in the official narrative, those voices were twisted into shouts of menace, their courage reframed as rebellion. For many in positions of power, admitting the reality, that heavily armed officers had fired without justification into a group of unarmed students, was unthinkable. To acknowledge such a truth would be to accept responsibility for lives lost and futures destroyed. And so, a different version was offered to the public, one that cast blame not on the men who pulled the triggers, but on the very students who had fallen. The story spread quickly, carried by headlines and evening broadcasts. Reports spoke of student violence, of chaos on the campus, of a situation that had spiraled out of control. For those who had not been there, for families watching from afar, the official narrative became the dominant one. It was easier, perhaps, for the nation to believe that the tragedy had been provoked than to face the uncomfortable reality that innocent students had been gunned down without cause. But for the survivors, the weight of this falsehood was crushing. They knew the truth because they had lived it. They remembered running unarmed, hands raised, seeking safety as the bullets rained down. They remembered the cries of classmates calling for help, the desperate scramble to pull the wounded to safety. And they remembered, with aching clarity, that not a single shot had come from their side. To hear officials describe them as aggressors was to be silenced all over again, to have their suffering erased by a lie. Families of the victims felt the same wound reopen each time they heard the false reports. Parents who had lost their sons now had to endure whispers that those sons had been violent, that they had somehow brought tragedy upon themselves. The grief of losing a child was compounded by the injustice of seeing their names stained by accusations that had no basis in fact. The narrative of student aggression served a purpose. It shielded the authorities from accountability. It turned public attention away from questions of responsibility and toward debates about discipline, order, and control. It fed into long-standing stereotypes that painted young black voices demanding justice as threats rather than citizens exercising their rights. In doing so, it obscured the true story of Orangeburg and delayed the recognition that its victims deserved. Yet, despite the weight of the false narrative, the truth did not disappear. Survivors continued to speak, to share what they had seen and endured. Historians and journalists dug deeper, uncovering evidence that contradicted the official story. Over time, cracks appeared in the carefully constructed version of events, revealing the reality that officials had worked so hard to suppress. The contrast between the false narrative and the lived truth of the student serves as one of the most painful aspects of the Orangeburg tragedy. The gunfire itself ended in less than 15 seconds, but the damage done by the lies lingered for decades. They robbed the victims of their dignity, silenced the survivors, and distorted public memory of what had truly taken place. Today, looking back, it is clear that the false claims were as damaging as the violence itself. They remind us that history is not only shaped by what happens, but by how those events are told, recorded, and remembered. The students of Orangeburg were not aggressors. They were young men and women standing for dignity, caught in a moment that turned deadly through no fault of their own. The lesson of their story is not only about the tragedy of that February night, but about the power of narrative itself. Lies can spread quickly, but the truth, no matter how long it takes, has a way of emerging. And when it does, it challenges us not just to remember what happened, but to ask why the truth was hidden in the first place. The students deserved better in life, and they deserved honesty in death. To honor them now is to strip away the falsehoods and let their voices finally be heard. When the last echoes of gunfire had faded and the community of Orangeburg began to bury its dead, many believed justice would follow. Families clung to the hope that those responsible for the tragedy would be held accountable, that the truth of what had happened would finally be recognized in a court of law. But what unfolded in the months and years after the massacre added another painful layer to the story, one that revealed just how tilted the scales of justice could be. 9 officers were brought to trial, charged with the use of excessive force. For many in the community, this seemed like the first step toward accountability. Witnesses had testified, survivors had spoken of the horror, and the facts were plain: the students had been unarmed, and the officers had fired into a crowd. Yet, when the verdict came, it was not justice that the families received, but disappointment. All 9 officers were acquitted. The law, in its cold language, had chosen to believe that their actions were justified, that their claim of self-defense was enough to erase the lives lost and the wounds inflicted. The acquittal sent shockwaves through the community. To the families, it felt like a denial of reality, as though the suffering they had endured was invisible. The students had run for their lives, defenseless and unarmed, yet the men who pulled the triggers walked away free. This was not only an absence of justice, it was a rewriting of the story itself, one that painted law enforcement as victims and the students as aggressors. And while the officers went free, another man found himself in the crosshairs of the system. His name was Cleveland Sellers, a respected activist and member of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Sellers had not fired a shot, nor had he led anyone into violence. Yet he became the face of blame for the authorities. They charged him not with any act of violence, but with inciting a riot. The irony was sharp. A man who had dedicated himself to nonviolence, who had stood alongside countless others to demand dignity and fairness, was accused of provoking the very chaos that had left students dead and wounded. The trial against Sellers became a way for officials to shift the narrative once again. Instead of focusing on the officers who had fired their weapons, attention was redirected toward an activist whose only crime was standing for justice. Sellers was convicted and sentenced to prison. The decision broke many hearts in the movement. It was clear to those watching that his imprisonment was less about evidence and more about making an example. By punishing Sellers, authorities sent a message to other activists: challenge the system, and you will pay the price, whether you are guilty or not. Behind bars, Sellers carried the weight not only of his own unjust conviction but also of the memory of the students whose lives had been taken. He knew his sentence was part of a broader pattern, a reflection of how deeply the system resisted acknowledging the rights and voices of Black communities. His conviction stood as the only one to come from the tragedy, a grim symbol of how justice had been inverted. Decades later, the truth of his story would finally begin to shift. In the 1990s and early 2000s, as historians and activists worked to bring renewed attention to the Orangeburg Massacre, Sellers's case was revisited. Those who had once branded him an instigator began to recognize the injustice of his trial. In time, his conviction was overturned, and he was granted a pardon. But by then, years had passed, and the damage had been done. A man's life had been disrupted, his reputation scarred, and an entire community reminded of how fragile justice could be. The acquittal of the 9 officers and the conviction of Cleveland Sellers stand as twin markers of the injustice that followed Orangeburg. On one side, those who had carried weapons and fired into a crowd faced no lasting consequences. On the other, a man committed to nonviolence was imprisoned for actions he did not commit. Together, these outcomes revealed how easily power could bend the truth, how courts could reinforce the very inequalities the students had been protesting. Looking back, the story is not only about who was punished and who was spared, but about what these choices signaled. They told the nation that the deaths of young students could be brushed aside, that official narratives would be protected at all costs, and that activists would bear the brunt of the blame. And yet, the persistence of Sellers himself offers a different lesson. Though imprisoned unjustly, he did not abandon the cause for which he had fought. In later years, he became an educator, a mentor, and a voice reminding the next generation of what had happened in Orangeburg. His story, like that of the students, is one of resilience in the face of deep injustice. The acquittals and the wrongful conviction cannot be undone, but they remind us of the importance of truth. Justice delayed and distorted does not erase the facts of what occurred. The memory of Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton cannot be erased by courtroom verdicts or official statements. And the story of Cleveland Sellers, though marked by injustice, continues as a testament to endurance and the power of truth to outlast even the strongest lies. In the days that followed the tragedy in Orangeburg, grief spread through the campus and the surrounding community. Families mourned, classmates wept, and survivors carried the heavy silence of what they had seen. Yet outside the town, in the wider world, the story barely made a ripple. Newspapers carried only small headlines, and television broadcasts gave it passing mentions, if they covered it at all. For many Americans, the massacre was not front-page news, it was a footnote. This silence is perhaps one of the most painful parts of the story. The nation had witnessed coverage of civil rights marches before, from Selma to Birmingham, where the images of peaceful protesters facing violence had stirred outrage and inspired change. But Orangeburg did not become one of those defining moments. Instead, it slipped into the shadows, known intimately by the families and community who lived it, but largely invisible to the country it should have shaken. Why was this so? Part of the answer lies in timing. The late 1960s were years of upheaval. Headlines were dominated by the Vietnam War, political turmoil, and the coming presidential election. Newsrooms were already overwhelmed with stories of unrest across the nation, and in that crowded space, the suffering of a small college town was easily overlooked. The violence in Orangeburg coincided with other major events, and in the race to capture the biggest headlines, editors pushed it aside. But timing alone does not explain the silence. When tragedy struck at Kent State 2 years later, where 4 white students were killed during an anti-war protest, the nation erupted. Images of young people lying on the ground, shot by National Guardsmen, were splashed across the front pages of newspapers. Protests spread to campuses nationwide. The story of Kent State became a symbol, an emblem of government overreach and youth resistance. Orangeburg, however, never received that level of attention. And here lies the harder truth: the victims were young black students, and their lives did not command the same national outrage. In a society still deeply divided by race, the suffering of black communities was too often ignored or minimized. The massacre did not fit the narrative many news outlets were willing to tell. To acknowledge fully what had happened in Orangeburg would have meant confronting the uncomfortable reality that unarmed black students had been gunned down by state authorities. For many editors and officials, it was easier to accept the official narrative, that the students had been violent, that order had been threatened, that the situation was somehow provoked. This false framing further muted the story, making it easier for the public to turn the page and move on. The voices of survivors were drowned out, their truth buried beneath the weight of indifference and misrepresentation. For the students and families left behind, this absence of national recognition deepened the pain. Not only had their children and friends been taken from them, but their loss was met with silence. No great wave of protest rose up in their defense, no sweeping national conversation brought their names into households across the country. They were left to grieve largely on their own, their tragedy confined to local memory while the rest of the nation looked elsewhere. Yet within that silence, the community refused to forget. At South Carolina State, the names of Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton were remembered with reverence. Survivors told and retold their stories, determined that the truth would not vanish, even if the world was not ready to hear it. Their persistence kept the memory alive, planting seeds that later generations of historians and activists would uncover. The contrast between Orangeburg and Kent State reveals much about whose stories America chooses to amplify. Both were moments when young people were met with state violence. Both raised questions about authority, rights, and justice. But only one became a national symbol, while the other remained hidden in the margins of history. This difference is not just about media coverage, it reflects the deeper inequities that shaped American life then and, in many ways, still linger today. The muted response to Orangeburg underscores how easily black suffering could be overlooked, how quickly the lives of young black students could be dismissed or forgotten. It is a sobering reminder that history is not only about what happens, but about who tells the story, and whose voices are heard. Today, as we look back, it becomes clear that the lack of attention was itself an injustice. The silence added to the weight carried by survivors and families, forcing them to fight not only against grief but against erasure. And yet, their determination to preserve the memory of Orangeburg is a testament to resilience. They refused to let silence have the last word. The story of Orangeburg may not have filled the front pages of 1968, but it lives on now because people have insisted that it must. By revisiting it, by sharing it, we begin to correct the imbalance that allowed it to fade from national memory. In doing so, we honor the students not just for how they died, but for what they stood for, the belief that dignity and justice are worth raising your voice for, even when the world is not listening. For decades after the tragedy in Orangeburg, the silence was heavy. The names of Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton were spoken quietly in their community, remembered in family gatherings, whispered in classrooms, and carried in the memories of those who had been there. Outside of Orangeburg, however, the story faded. National conversations moved on, history textbooks omitted the event, and for many years the massacre lived in the shadows of America's collective memory. But the truth never truly disappears. Survivors carried it with them like a burden they could not set down, and families refused to let their loved ones vanish into obscurity. Every retelling, every testimony, every effort to share what had happened kept the memory alive. In the 1980s and 1990s, a new wave of historians began to take notice, digging through records, collecting oral histories, and piecing together the narrative that had been suppressed for so long. What they uncovered was not simply the story of a single night of violence, but of resilience in the face of silence. Communities began to demand recognition. Students at South Carolina State College, where the tragedy unfolded, pushed for the story to be taught and honored. Local leaders joined in the call, insisting that justice might never be fully served in the courts, but that the truth could still find its rightful place in memory. Over time, their persistence bore fruit. Memorials were established on campus, with plaques and monuments that bore the names of the fallen. These were not just physical markers, but symbols of a community's refusal to forget. As the years passed, apologies began to emerge. Public officials who had once stood by silently, or who had repeated the false narratives of the past, began to acknowledge the wrongs committed. In speeches and ceremonies, they recognized the pain carried by families and admitted that the tragedy had been mishandled at every level. These apologies, though late, were meaningful. They could not undo the harm, but they offered a sense of acknowledgement, a recognition that the lives lost had value and that the silence which followed had been a second injustice. For the survivors, the recognition was bittersweet. Nothing could erase the trauma of that February night, nor could any words restore the futures that had been taken away. Yet to see their struggle validated, to watch as the names of their classmates were spoken with reverence rather than buried in silence, was a form of healing. It meant that the story would not disappear again, that future generations would know what had happened in Orangeburg. Today, the massacre is remembered not only as a moment of deep injustice, but also as a symbol of resilience. It is a reminder of how communities can fight against erasure, how truth can survive even when it is buried, and how memory itself can become an act of resistance. The students of South Carolina State had gathered in hope and determination, and though their lives were cut short, their courage echoes still. The legacy of Orangeburg challenges us to ask difficult questions. How do we ensure that stories like this are not forgotten? How do we honor those who stood for justice, even when the world turned away? And perhaps most importantly, how do we learn from these moments to build a more honest and inclusive future? By remembering, by speaking, by telling the story again and again, we resist the forces of silence. The names of Samuel Hammond, Henry Smith, and Delano Middleton remind us that history is not just dates and facts, it is human lives, with dreams, laughter, and futures that mattered. Their memory calls us to carry forward the work they could not finish, to seek truth even when it is uncomfortable, and to honor resilience even when it emerges from pain. So, as we close this story, let us carry it with us, not just as a tragedy of the past, but as a lesson for the present and future. Let us speak their names, honor their memory, and ensure their story continues to live on. If you found this story meaningful, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it so that more people can learn about the history that must never be forgotten. Thank you for joining me tonight, and until we meet again, I wish you all a peaceful and restful good night.